Alright, let's finish up talking about different kinds of management tools, and I just have some miscellaneous things that we might use in fish management. And you see the highlighted ones are the ones we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about these just kind of very briefly. The first is Creole Studies. Basically going out to find out what the anglers want, how much they're catching, how far they travel, how much money they spend, get an estimate of fishing mortality. That whole, remember we talked about fish management is managing, the fish, the people, and the habitat, and this is basically a big part of managing the people, or understanding what the people want. And there's a lot of science to this. There are whole volumes about how to conduct a Creole study. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time getting into all the details. Realize that this is a very sociological type of research. So it's going to be different techniques, and there's going to be a lot of different things you have to worry about if you're going to do a proper Creole study. The big thing is the quality of the data depends upon the skill of the interviewer. And this makes very much sense. If you have someone who's not a people person that goes and tries to collect these data, it's not going to be as good as somebody who's very comfortable talking to people and can get a lot of information out of them. Lots of different ways you can do a Creole study. The roving clerk is probably one of the more common ones, where you just go and interview everyone who's fishing at a particular time on a particular day. The boat dock is also really common, simply because that's a nice choke point where you can get a lot of people going through one small area, so you can sit there and talk to everyone. It's really good if that's the only access, or if you have limited access, where you're going to catch people going in or out of the lake. Stationary sectors is where you break up the lake into different sectors, choose one at random, and go talk to everybody in that section. It's one way of a kind of a randomized block design, or a stratified design, which we'll talk about here in a second. The stationary sectors doesn't work as well these days, or in places where you've got a lot of bass fishermen, a lot of bass boats, because people can hop around from sector to sector so much more quickly than you can. That makes this a tough way to study the Creole. An instantaneous count is something where you take an airplane and fly over and basically take a snapshot and count how many boats you see to get a rough idea of how many people are fishing in a large body of water. The printed questionnaire is an idea where you would hand out or send out a questionnaire, and then people would mail it back in. My understanding is these are fairly unreliable, that people just won't do it, and the only ones that'll do it will be the ones that are most motivated. Something that does get a lot of information, that has shown to be pretty useful for Creole studies, is a fishing diary, where you find people who fish a lot, and you give them basically a diary, and just ask them to record every fish they catch every time they go fishing. That sounds very unrealistic, but if you have well-motivated people, you can get really good high-quality data from this. But again, it is only from those handful of well-motivated anglers that go out a lot. There's a lot that goes on with these Creole studies. As I said, any of these can be stratified. We talked about breaking the lake into strata and randomly choosing one of those. But another way that we stratify the Creole studies is to direct your Creole effort in proportion to typical fishing effort. So, for example, if you just said, I'm going to go and randomly pick out one day a week for an entire year to go do a Creole study, that sounds good because you're just randomly picking a day. However, you're not going to get as high quality of information because people don't go out at random. They're going to be out fishing more on weekends and holidays. And so you can get more information and better quality information if you sample more and do more of your Creole on those days when you have more fishing pressure. And of course there is a strategy to exactly how you choose which days and how many hours you go out, but you get the idea that just randomly picking a day isn't necessarily the best way to get your creel info. And as I said, there's a lot that goes into Creole Studies. This is just a brief intro, but you understand how having such a study is essential if you really want to understand your fishery and what the anglers want and what they're getting and what you need to do to give them what they want. Okay, another tool seems pretty obvious, and again there's a lot to this. There's a lot to regulations. We're not going to be able to get into every single little detail, but you understand that this is another way that we can kind of manage people and manage their influence with the fishery, is how we regulate and the rules that they have when they go fishing. Now, you can say that the fishing regulations have several different types of goals: ecological goals, sociological goals, and informational goals. And different type of regulations have different varying inputs to these different sort of goals. So an ecological goal is the regulation is designed to influence the fish, or perhaps the habitat. You know, actually there's a problem that you see in the actual fish population that needs to be corrected through a regulation. Sociological is because you're looking at a problem or a situation with the people, with the anglers and the people that use the resource, and you need to do some kind of regulation to make that fair. Informational is what it sounds like, is that you need some information so that you can better serve the citizens. And of course, the different goals are going to change based upon a sport fish management or a commercial management situation. Sometimes they're going to come into conflict. So let's give some examples of some of these regulations. Of course, licenses. Pretty much everywhere you go, you have to buy a license. And these are somewhat informational, so you get some basic demographic data on who buys a license, but it doesn't really tell you who uses a license, so you don't get a ton of information about this. There are also sociological goals toward this. For example, the DJ money gets parsed out from the feds collect this money from the Dingell-Johnson tax, and then they give it back to the states, and how much each state gets is partially dependent upon how many licenses they sell. So selling licenses is a way to help divvy up that money, which is a sociological goal of licenses. But we don't really seem to have any sort of, making somebody buy a license to go fishing doesn't really in any way directly affect the ecology in the fish community, so it doesn't really have an ecological goal. Okay, size limits. There are several different ways you can do a size limit. For example, you can have a minimum size limit. So a fish has to be a particular size before you're allowed to take it. There can be many different reasons why you might want to have this. For example, it seems pretty obvious that this will protect younger fish. So anything that's small has to go back in and you give it time to grow. These work well in a fast-growing population. So if I throw that small fish back in a few weeks or a few months, it is going to be big enough and it's going to be above the minimum size. If you don't have a fast-growing population, fish tend to hang up right below the minimum. And that's very, very common and something that you see in a lot of fisheries. When you have a minimum size limit, even in a fast-growing population, if you keep throwing back the small ones, you're going to have this large population of small fish that are all competing, and so even if they were growing quickly, they're going to start growing slower. And so a minimum size limit runs that risk that you're going to have a lot of fish stacked up right below the minimum, and then if you've got a lot of fishing pressure, this happens a lot in a commercial fishery, that the second that they grow large enough to eclipse that minimum size, they get yoinked out because the anglers are putting a lot of pressure on them. So you need to be careful with a minimum size limit. Another reason you might have a minimum size limit is in a commercial fishery if you're trying to maximize biomass. So you set that minimum size limit to protect growth overfishing, where the fish are taken out before they can get to their maximum size, and by limiting the size of the fish you can take, you give them a chance to grow bigger. You can actually increase the overall biomass. You can actually increase the amount of biomass that can be harvested up to a point. You can have a maximum size limit, and these are not nearly as common. You can probably think of different reasons why you might have a maximum size limit that's going to protect your spawning adults. Rarely is spawning a problem, and so that's why these are more rare. Also, if you're trying to get a trophy fishery, you might have a 20-inch maximum on largemouth bass. If you catch any large, extremely large fish, it needs to go back in, not only so that we can catch it again, but also so that it can reproduce and pass those genes on, those alleles on that made it big, and you can perhaps increase the overall size structure. Another common one is a slot limit. So this is where you protect a certain important size range of fish. So very common one you're going to find is a 12 to 15 inch slot on largemouth bass. And so anything less than this you can take, anything greater than this you can take. A lot of times it's combined with kind of a maximum creel limit. For example, you can take as many as you want below the slot, but only 2 above the slot each day. You see this a lot of times. So again, there's a lot of reasons why this might work. Usually this is a vulnerable age where they need protection. You think of a 12 to 15 inch range in a largemouth. That's a range where people might start keeping fish. Again, it's a little different from largemouth. You've got a lot of catch and release in the largemouth community. This is why you need a Creole study, so you understand what kind of pressure and what kind of anglers you have. A lot of times this is used in largemouth bass because it's an efficient predator size. And so 12 to 15 inch bass, that's an eater. Okay, that's a bass that can eat a lot of the prey in the lake and wants to eat a lot. It's growing rapidly, needs a lot of energy. So a lot of times that's why you want to keep these in there, because they're going to put the maximum pressure on, say, the gizzard shad, and they're going to keep those gizzard shad in check. And that's a big use of the slot limit. The slot limit, though, only works if the sub-slot fish are removed. Think about it. If you've got a lot of bass anglers that are catch and release and they catch a 10-inch bass, they're not going to want to keep that 10-inch bass. They're going to throw it back. And if everybody does that, then what do you have? You have a 15-inch minimum length is what you have. People are only taking fish that are above 15 inches. And what happens with a minimum size limit? Well, we said they usually stack up right below that minimum size limit. So a slot limit usually has to be accompanied by a lot of education of the anglers that we really need you to take out these sub-slot bass for this to work. And even if you don't want to kill them, chuck them on the bank, let the coons have them. Now, I mentioned Creole limits. Of course, how many fish you're allowed to take each day. For sport fish, these are more sociological. The goals are more sociological. And that's to spread the fish over more users. A lot of times we think of a sport fish creel limit, say, I can only take 6 channel cats a day out at Spring Lake. And you think, oh, well, that's to make sure that we don't overfish those channel cats. We've got to limit how many each person can take. And in sport fishing, that's very, very rarely the reason, because the anglers simply can't take out enough. You have your handful of hardcore people that are out there every day that can limit out every day, but still that's only going to be a handful. In general, sport fishing anglers won't overfish a population. Again, over reproduction and having too many fish is more often the problem. And in fact, you want to encourage the anglers to take more home with them if you want to get a good size structure. And so we still have a lot of creel limits. Why is that? Well, we want to spread the fish over more users. So you don't want those handful of people that go out every day to just go. There are people that will sit out there for hours, and if you don't have a limit on it, they can take home 25, 30 fish a day every day, and that starts to become unfair, and it can have the potential, I guess it still probably wouldn't necessarily have the potential, but it's just not fair that those people get all the benefit from these fish. Now in commercial fishing, the creel limit has more ecological goals, because the commercial people are very efficient and they're out every day and they're trying to make money, and so they can overfish the community, and so there's a different goal with the creel limits there. Other type of regulations you might have would be closed seasons or closed areas. So a closed season, why might you have a closed season? We have these, you see this in hunting a lot, where there's only certain seasons where you can go out. Not so much in fisheries. A lot of times there's an ecological reason, because you want to protect the spawn. And as we talked about earlier, in the early 1900s, these are some of the first regulations where you would close the season so that the fish were not stressed out while they were spawning. We found out that's really not much of a problem. And so you don't see many closed seasons for a lot of our fish, because they have no problem reproducing. And in fact, a lot of people like to go fishing during the spawn, because that's when the males are, the fish are really aggressive and they're feeding a lot. There is some people that argue in certain situations that maybe the largemouth bass season should be, there should be a closed season when the largemouth bass are spawning, because there's a lot of stress involved and a lot of mortality when those males are guarding the nests, and that can have, and that's maybe not necessarily can reduce the numbers, but it can have a disproportionate effect on the genetics, and you'll have a smaller effective population size and things like that. You can get more genetic drift. But there's a lot of people don't feel that way, and we've had very few closed seasons, and it doesn't seem to influence the relative numbers of the fish that are out there. There are also sociological reasons, and a lot of times when you have a closed season, it's much more for a sociological reason than an ecological reason. And mostly it's because if you have a closed season, that means you have an opening day. If you have an opening day, those are fun, and those are a big deal, right? Everyone thinks about, hey, when's opening day of this season or that season? And there's lots of tradition involved. I mean, I've always gone opening day with my grandpa. We always hit opening day because that's what we've done. We haven't been able to fish for these fish, and consequently you sell a lot of licenses and you get a lot more people out. It's almost like a holiday for a lot of people, and so that is more often than not the reason why you have a closed season for a lot of these fisheries. Now, a closed area is usually for human protection, like below a spillway is closed because it's a dangerous area. There's dangerous undertows. Water levels can change rapidly. But also you can have closed areas to protect spawning fish. That if you know that they're going to spawn in a certain area, and instead of closing the whole season, you can at least close that area off and protect those fish when they're most vulnerable. So that would be another reason to have a closed area. You also might have an area that's off limits to certain types of angling. So for example, in a lot of your trout streams, you might have an area that's that's fly only or catch and release only. So the anglers that are using spinners or marshmallows or worms can't fish there. So you can have an area where you have a little bit less harvest. And also for fly fishing, a lot of times the experience of just being with a handful of other people who are fly fishing is what they're looking for. They don't want to see a lot of, they don't like it when there's a lot of people all crowded together and everybody's beating the water with spinner baits. All right, our next tool is fish removal, which we talk about a lot, and is often a big goal, is to get the numbers down or get the numbers of a certain size class down. Again, over reproduction is often our problem. And so if we got to get rid of some fish, commercial removal is probably the most effective way, because commercial fishermen are very good at locating and removing lots of fish. So trying to do with the Asian carp in the Illinois River, and it can be very effective, often too effective. And certainly if you're looking at sport fish, this is not necessarily a good strategy, because the sport fishermen think it's very unfair. You know, how come I have to use a plastic worm while they can use a gill net? And so this doesn't really work for sport fish. Of course, also, you know, sport fish, a lot of times you're looking to remove a certain size range of fish. But, for example, in some of the bigger reservoirs here in Illinois, I think Wren Lake used to, or still does, has a commercial fishery for buffalo, and common carp in, say, Wren Lake, maybe Carlisle Lake. Those are quote-unquote rough fish, or not really sport fish that people want, and so you have the commercial fishermen remove them. Poisoning, we've talked about rotenone, and in smaller water bodies, farm ponds, this is much more common. Very effective, of course. Can be somewhat selective if you do it just right, but usually it's not very selective. So for pressing the reset button, poisoning is usually the best way. And of course, stalking predators or protecting certain size ranges of predators is going to be a really good way to remove certain fish that you don't want. More often than not, we're trying to get rid of too many prey fish, too many gizzard shad. And of course, there's always lots of factors that go along here, right? If you go and do something to remove a lot of gizzard shad, to remove a lot of one particular species, well then what's going to happen? You're going to have compensatory growth and compensatory fecundity. If you have basic ecology, if you have fewer of that one species, the individuals that remain will have more food, they'll grow better, they'll survive better, they'll produce more young, and so you have to acknowledge that's going to happen. Now, you can do this strategically. If you remove a lot of gizzard shad, the remaining ones grow big, they will have lots of babies, but then that generation of shad will be stunted out, and it might last for a couple, 3 years where you've got this high density of small shad that's a great prey base. But then eventually those small shad get too big, and if you get too much competition, I mean, you understand this. You can think about this, how you can have a lot of small shad that are great prey base, but they also might compete with another species for food. You have to think about your goals, and you realize that there's no magic bullet that's going to last forever, that any management strategy, especially with fish removal, is going to work well for a number of years. And as we talked about before, if you've got to keep putting energy in to maintaining that, and if you don't, well then you're going to get out of balance, and you're going to have to do some sort of management strategy to get the community back into balance. Okay, habitat improvements. We talk about managing fish, managing people, managing habitat. Habitat is always important. We always have to think about habitat. In lotic situations, this is a big deal. Lots of streams have been degraded, lots of streams have been channelized, lots of streams have had their banks cleared off. And so, especially for things like trout streams, habitat improvement is a huge deal, because you simply will not have good survival and good reproduction unless you have the habitat restored back to its original state, where you've got the proper substrate, the proper vegetation, and the proper shading and things like that. So stream restoration is a big deal. In lentic systems, there's all kinds of ways you can improve habitat. Fish attractors are very popular. Now, sometimes I think that people do this without thinking too much. A lot of times the fish attractors you put in are going to improve survival of young fish, which may or may not be what you want. But in a lot of human-made reservoirs, you don't often have any or much natural habitat. In fact, a lot of times they go out of their way to clean the shorelines, and so you don't have a lot of snags and stick-ups and vegetation and things like that. And in that situation, a fish attractor might be the only habitat they have, and so it doesn't necessarily increase the number of fish, but it does pack them into a smaller area and gives the fishermen, I think there's something to be said for giving the fishermen something to cast at. If you go to just an empty blank shoreline, well, where do I throw my lure? But if you have some area where they know there's at least some habitat, well, at least I've got something to aim at, and I know there's going to be fish there. Spawning benches, I've seen this done with like smallmouth bass, and it's basically just take a log and you make a small piece of log that runs parallel to the ground with a couple of other logs holding it up, and the idea is to create like a bench somewhere that the fish can go underneath. And I think the smallmouth and other species like to use this for spawning or for ambush sites. Again, I think there's a lot of potential for research into the construction of fish attractors and how you can build these things to accomplish different goals. Maybe they'll attract different sizes of fish, or there'll be ambush areas or shade areas or things like that. And the spawning benches are one way to do that. And PVC attractors and sunken Christmas trees all are going to do different things. Improving the vegetation. As I said, a lot of times we want to get rid of vegetation. It becomes too much, but the right vegetation can be very helpful. Something that will absorb wave energy so the waves don't hit the shoreline at full force and stir up sediment, and the roots of the vegetation will hold down the sediment, and it'll provide a spot perhaps for an ambush spot for predators, but it also might provide cover for smaller fish, which again may or may not be something that you want. Destratification, which we do at Spring Lake. If you've got a lot of oxygen in the top half meter but then nothing else, that's going to really stress the fish out. So maybe you can mix that oxygen down and then also in turn improve the lock up the phosphorus and improve the eutrophication of a lake by destratifying it. Bank stabilization, again, big reservoirs. If you've got a lot of boat traffic and a lot of wave activity from boats, or if you've got a lot of fetch, so you've got a lot of wind activity that stirs up and erodes those banks, you can put in vegetation, you can put in riprap. Aeration, especially in small farm ponds, where you can potentially mix enough water and spray it into the air and improve the oxygen level a little bit. Okay, and as I said, you can add vegetation. Often we want to remove vegetation. Often vegetation is a problem. Well, we've already talked about vegetation removal. Recall that there's mechanical, chemical, and biological ways to remove vegetation. So we've already talked about that. Feeding fish is another tool in our toolbox. When we talk about fish feeding, you talk about prepared feed. Don't say artificial feed. The aquaculture people will jump on you. I've been jumped on this before. There's nothing fake about the feed that comes out of a sack. It's prepared feed. And of course you can use that to feed your fish, or you can stock natural food. You can buy minnows and stock them. I always talk about a great strategy is to build small sub-ponds around your main pond and raise fathead minnows. And then every once in a while you open a valve and flood a few of those minnows into the pond. Of course, you can go down and hand feed your fish. A lot of people love to do this. It's a lot of fun, and it's a great way to also get a feel for how many fish you do have in the lake. Automatic feeders are fantastic. They're very affordable. There's also something that I don't think enough people use, but the aquaculture people use a lot, which is a demand feeder, and it's very cool. It's a feeder that basically you can make one of these out of a 5-gallon bucket, and it's got a hole in the bottom, and a rod comes through the bottom that goes into the water, and you adjust it in such a way that the the feed will stay in there unless that rod is bumped. And if that rod is bumped, it'll knock a little bit of food in the water. Well, it doesn't take the fish too long. You have to maybe train them and throw some food in by yourself for a while. But pretty soon the fish figure out that when they bump that, food comes in. And once you have that, then they'll just feed themselves on demand. And in aquaculture, there's a lot of success because you don't overfeed and you don't underfeed. And I think there's a lot of potential for these things in private ponds. Of course, another way to feed fish is to just fertilize the pond. And you can stimulate productivity and you can produce a lot more food right there within the pond. And this is probably the most cost-effective and easiest way to increase the biomass of your fish. Of course, as always, you're watching the nitrogen to phosphorus level. You want 10 to 50 times as much nitrogen as phosphorus. Too much phosphorus means nitrogen becomes limiting, means blue-green algae become much more likely to show up. And as of course, you're always watching the oxygen levels. You don't want to do this from July through August. It's too hot, and you can get too much productivity, which can ultimately end up sucking the oxygen out of the water. So you got to be real careful about how much you give and when you give it. All right. Next thing I want to talk about is drawdown. Drawdown is a really important tool. And Dr. Heidegger always said that if there was one tool that he could pick to use, it would be this. There's so much that you can do if you can control the water levels. Often, though, it's impossible. You think a lot of the reservoirs you work on weren't built with a water control structure. However, people that are constructing ponds, I always encourage them, put in some kind of water control structure because you'll be glad that you did. A lot of potential benefits here. For example, you can control the spawn. And so rising water levels will stimulate fish to spawn. Also, if you wait till they spawn and you drop the levels, you can leave a lot of nests high and dry. So if you want to limit a lot of spawning. Realize that a lot of our sport fish evolved in rivers. And when the rivers come up in the spring, that's what usually triggers them to spawn. And you can do this in aquaculture. You can do this a lot of times with temperature. You can control the temperature to control the spawn. But in a larger system where you can't control the temperature, the water levels can control the spawn. If you could do this, you could be creative sometimes. For example, it's worked in the past in certain situations where you raise the water levels in summer, and that stimulates a second spawn of the gizzard shad. You raise the water levels and then drop them, that causes the gizzard shad to have a second spawn late in summer, which gives you a pulse of very small, vulnerable gizzard shad right at the end of summer, right where this year's young of the year largemouth are starting to switch to piscivory. And so you can provide a large number of vulnerable forage to those largemouth just right when they want them and just before they go into winter, which can have very important cascading effects. So if you think about this, you can be creative, you can do a lot if you are able to control the water levels. Another common use of a drawdown is to pull forage out of the vegetation and concentrate it. So if you've got a lot of vegetation, the forage might not be very vulnerable, you can make them vulnerable. That's what we're going to be doing with Argyle Lake this fall. Speaking of aquatic vegetation, this is a great way to kill that aquatic vegetation. A lot of this vegetation needs to be submerged, so you draw the water out, you let it dry out, and it'll die. It's a great way to control vegetation. It helps to consolidate the sediments. 12 inches of muck will pack down to 1 inch over a couple of months if it's allowed to dry out. And so if you get that organic matter that builds up and you get a softer and softer bottom that gets stirred up easy, well, you draw the water down, let that stuff dry out, and it'll get a lot more firm. At the same time, you're going to oxidize the sediments, and that's always a good thing, right? Anytime you get oxygen down to the sediments, that keeps the phosphorus locked up into the sediments. This also is good for denitrifying those moist soils. are where the nitrogen in the water gets turned back into nitrogen gas, which gets released to the atmosphere, so that can help to reduce both the phosphorus and the nitrogen in your water. Practical aspect, if you got to do work on a boat ramp or a spillway, or you want to do shoreline, drawing the water down allows you to do this. So there's just so many potential things you can do if you can control the level of the water. One strategy that people use sometimes is to draw down in the summer, plant terrestrial vegetation like milo or something like that, reflood it in the fall. All that terrestrial vegetation is right when it's starting to flower or produce seed, and so that is great for duck hunting, great duck food. The reflooding kills the vegetation, so then you draw down again in the winter, just to get that vegetation out of the water, so you won't get much decomposition in the water. But at any rate, when you reflood in the spring, all that rotten vegetation is going to provide a lot of nutrients. That's going to stimulate zooplankton production. It might improve your growth of your H0 fish, or it might not. But the thing is, if you think about everything that's going on, you can think about creative strategies that can be done with the drawdown. Now, if you do that concentrating forage, something that needs to be mentioned, make sure you have enough predators for this to work. If you just draw them down, but you don't have a heavy predator base, it's not going to have much of an effect. Argyle Lake, I think it's going to work fine. There's plenty of saugeye and largemouth out there. So this is a technique that's often much more effective if you use it to prevent a problem, not solve a problem. If you have too much, even drawing them down out of the vegetation, if you have too much prey, it might not necessarily work. Okay, so what's the flip side to a drawdown? Well, what if it doesn't rain? Drawdown implies that it's eventually going to come back up. This is 2012. We're in a very terrible drought. So if we had done some kind of winter drawdown, the lakes may have never refilled. You've got a small volume and surface area in the winter, which means it's easier to get a winter kill. You might get a harder freeze, things like that. Of course, if it doesn't rain, you might not get that reflooding and all the benefits that you expect from the reflood, or if you want to try to stimulate a spawn, but if the water never comes back up. So that's a risk that you take. Few small ponds have this ability. Few medium reservoirs have this ability. A lot of larger reservoirs, I'm talking big reservoirs, Army Corps of Engineer reservoirs, you often can control the water level, but fish are a low priority, right? You're generating electricity, or you've got barges that are moving through, or you've got people that have houses and developments on the shoreline, and they don't want the water to go up and down. So you might have the ability to do something, but you're not going to be allowed to do it because the fishermen don't have as much clout. Okay, last tool that we're going to mention here is stocking. Now, we can talk for hours and hours about the merits and the drawbacks of stocking. I just want to point out a few things. Advantages: clearly it's a direct controlled manipulation of the fish community. So, we're trying to manipulate the fish community and fish management, and here's a direct controlled way of doing it. So you've got a lot of influence on what goes into this water body. You can provide an otherwise unavailable fishery, for example, stocking trout in the tailwater fishery. You've got this tailwater, you've got this hot, cool water coming out from the dam. Traditional species, warm water species from that area probably can't survive there. The argument is, why not stock trout or something that you're not going to be able to get anywhere else? Of course, there's lots of other advantages to stocking. I'm clearly just glossing over this. Some disadvantages of stocking. For example, if it's not done properly, you can get high mortality. So a lot of times, if you just back the stocking truck up, open up the valve and let them go, the temperature shock, the oxygen shock, or just the shock of being moved can cause a lot of mortality. So it's something you need to think about. Be very careful, handle those fish with kid gloves whenever you're stocking them to help improve the mortality. You've got a lot of money invested in those fish. A lot of times you've got dumb fish that are being stocked. They're very naive. They're not afraid of humans, so you can get mortality that way. They haven't been exposed to predators. There are a lot of genetic concerns with stocking, and this is probably your biggest concern. You're getting the introgression of non-native alleles into your population, or you're getting hatchery alleles, or something called co-adapted gene complexes, where you've got several different genes that all work together, and all these different genes have evolved together so that the alleles that have been selected for at these different loci all maximize the fitness when they work together. But if you introduce alleles from a different population, you break up these co-adapted gene complexes, the alleles that are effective in this population are still around, but they're not in combination with alleles from other genes that they've evolved with, and so they're actually not as good for the fitness of the fish. That's one way that stocking hatchery fish or stocking fish can influence the genetics of your population. It's something called outbreeding depression. You can have too much variability, and so you can lower the fitness of those fish. So this can be a concern. Certainly moving fish from one basin to another have a lot of concern. You've got the same species, but they've evolved for different basins, so they've got different alleles, and the alleles that work in this basin might not work well in this basin. It's something that can be a big concern. A lot of people are taking this a lot more seriously now. This used to not be taken seriously. Now hatcheries that are producing fish, they're very concerned about where they get their brood stock from and where these fish go back. And you also see that there's not a lot of situations where you've noticed that the fitness of the population has dropped due to stocking. But it is something that you need to be aware of. Finally, competition with natives. You can stock, say, walleye in a reservoir, and if those walleye escape, then they're going to compete with other native walleye that are in the tributary that they've escaped into. And so you might be introducing these hatchery fish that are healthy and large, and you're going to be out-competing native fish that are already there, and that might be something you want. Or they might be preying upon other prey species of native fish, and that's what you didn't want. So certainly stocking is something that you need to think about in great detail before you take part in it. Of course, another clear disadvantage is it's going to cost a lot to get a significant number of fish. Okay, that's all I have for management tools. We're going to finish up now by talking about how we can use these tools and things you've learned and different management strategies that are effective. And so if you got any questions, let me know, and that's all I've got. See ya.